Let's talk about love. You know, I was reading an anthology of Martin Luther King's sermons in a cafe. And as often happens, you know, there's always someone nosy who wants to know what I'm doing. Ask me what I'm reading. And so I said, I'm reading a sermon by Martin Luther King. Try not to tell him I was a minister yet. Don't always out myself right away. And he goes, oh, which one you reading? I'm like, Loving Your Enemies. And he looked at me, he's like, well, that's nice. Sounds like a good idea, but it's not very practical, is it? So that's why I'm here today talking about that with you. It's important to remember that the Reverend Dr. King was a devout Christian. His understanding of Jesus' message is what gave him energy, comfort, and tactics for the movement. So today we explore the scriptural challenge to love your enemies. It was a tactic that King used to bring greater liberty to his people, using the love known as Agape love, that redemptive, creative goodwill for all. So first, let us consider the Sermon on the Mount. This happens early in Jesus' ministry, and it takes place near his home in Galilee, which is way far north from Jerusalem. Galilee is rural, it's working class, sparsely populated. And just prior to this sermon, Jesus was baptized, gathered his disciples, and began healing the sick. It happened sort of in a whirlwind. Tales of this faith healer traveled fast among the small towns on the lake shore, and everyone came to get themselves healed or simply to witness this new powerful one. And as the crowds grew, Jesus walked up a hill overlooking the sea. Legend has it the Sermon on the Mount was delivered on Mount Eremos, up the shore from the Galilean Sea, not far from Capernaum, where Jesus once lived. So imagine this natural stage from which to preach. And at this time, Jesus is young, probably about 28, and his ministry is energetic and earnest. The Sermon on the Mount is the longest continuous presentation Jesus makes anywhere in the scriptures. It's Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. And the sermon is a rich explication of his philosophies of divinity, humanity, righteousness, and justice. What I discovered preparing for this sermon was that we must read the whole Sermon on the Mount as a piece so we can adequately feel its impact. Each carefully crafted appeal builds upon the last one. So imagine this audience of these fishermen, these oppressed, these forgotten. And Jesus speaks to them in ways to shock them into a new worldview, an upside-down moral reckoning. And he begins with the Beatitudes. You know these. Blessed are the mourners, the peacemakers, the merciful, the pure in spirit, the persecuted, and the gentle. Blessed are the gentle? Doesn't this seem counterintuitive? Hasn't the world shown us that it's the fierce, not the gentle, who will prevail? I wonder what his listeners were thinking, hearing this message. Indeed, by claiming things are true that our experience seems to show as false, Jesus invites us to reconsider our deepest assumptions of human thriving, asks us to see things in opposition to the way that our dominant culture champions. After the Beatitudes, Jesus invites us to beware of the promises that we make. Do not swear oaths. Do not hold grudges against family. Do not violate your wedding vows. And then, seeming to challenge common sense, he tells us to, when confronted with violence, to turn the other cheek, to not resist the oppressor with violence. And it is here that this part of the sermon reaches its apex as Jesus teaches us, love your enemies. Love is the greatest tool of resistance, he is telling us. And that love is agape, redemptive, creative love for all. So I remember being an earnest teenager and wondering when I first read this, is Jesus kidding? Has he met my enemies? How can I possibly live up to that? But that's what he asks us all. Jesus asks us to relinquish something that we often perceive that brings power and riches to our world, violence and the use of force. Instead, he asks us to channel a redemptive love force, agape. That's the Sermon on the Mount. But now let us compare Jesus with what Martin Luther King had to share. King's world, when he preaches this sermon, is November 1957. And he begins at this time, I believe, to understand that the struggle for black liberation would be generational. 1957 was 1 year after the Montgomery bus boycott successfully integrated buses. It inspired the Supreme Court to rule that segregation in public transportation is unconstitutional. Just 2 months prior, in September 1957, federal troops defended the integration of Central High in Little Rock. And what happens in response? But states like Texas and Florida voted to close all public schools if National Guardsmen were sent to integrate them. Indeed, it seemed it would be a long time before they would get another big civil rights victory. The movement had to go small, sit-in by sit-in, building organization and membership and momentum. In 1957, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was still 6 years away. The Voting Rights Act, 8 years away. Before preaching loving your enemies, Martin Luther King's last big headline was, "Give us a ballot." It was a speech May 17th, 1957 at the Lincoln Memorial. And this was part of the Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom campaign. King's I Have a Dream speech would be preached from this same spot 6 years later. King began spiritually preparing his people for a long, violent assault on their lives, their fortunes, their characters, their families. The forces arrayed against them were mighty and had state and governmental support. Indeed, the legislatures of this era, especially in the American South, were run by race baiters, often seeming to compete for who could appear the toughest and most racist in order to get elected. Corrupt court systems were lined with white supremacists on the bench, and American law was also stained with white supremacy. The prison system still allowed counties to lease prisoners, where they would actually sell the services of people to companies as low or no wage workers, simply because they were in jail. And the police, they too often acted when dealing with black Americans like state-sponsored terrorist militias, hell-bent on bludgeoning people into submission. This was a fraught and a horrifying time. And this picture from Bloody Sunday, it's only 55 years old. That's 2 years younger than me. Like Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount in 1957, King was young, just 28. And he, too, was eager and earnest. In 1955, he had been deemed the leader of the freedom movement in Montgomery, Alabama, Alabama's capital. And like Jesus, people gathered wherever King showed up. In early 1957, King became the first president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the umbrella group organizing the struggle for black liberation throughout the American South. He was chosen by his elder colleagues, he often said, because, well, he was the newest in town and he couldn't possibly say no. But I'm pretty sure that they recognized something special in him. He was thrust into national prominence, and thank God he had the preaching and intellectual chops to complement his organizational skills. Indeed, it was no mistake that King ended up serving Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. It's the church that sits at the bottom of the hill, just below the Alabama State Capitol, over there to the left. This was a perfect perch to preach truth to power. And into all of this, Martin Luther King climbed boldly into that pulpit, preaching this Sermon on the Mount, loving your enemies. In his age, the enemies of freedom were armed, violent, and dangerous. And he intuited that no insurrection, no armed popular rebellion had a chance against Alabama, Mississippi, or the federal government. Yet King intuited this moment held potential, and he refused to wait another century, hoping for white America to finally enable black liberation. Change must come now. And so King championed what he believed to be the only tactic that would work: nonviolent resistance, adopted from Mahatma Gandhi. This was an assertive stance of non-cooperation with the status quo. This was not passive. This was resistance without lethal force. Indeed, they resisted with the sacrificial presence of their bodies boldly blocking bayonets, their bodies being battered by bombs and bullies. He knew, because Jesus taught him that only nonviolent resistance had a chance. He knew to urge violent revolution would be to condemn his people to a suicide march. Many Americans openly preyed on their fellow Americans in those days, and they did it with impunity. They did this through lynching, mass incarceration, convict leasing, disenfranchisement, theft of wages and property, real estate fraud, redlining. I could go on all day. Yes, we were a sick society in the 1950s. And what are we today? Here was King telling his people, amidst all of these odds, all of this danger, to love those who wished to do them harm. So let us examine how radical this truly was to ask. In his sermon, King admits that Jesus' challenge to love your enemies is tough medicine. All around them were signs of violence, destruction, and ruin. He preached that we have returned hate for hate, violence for violence, and the world was not growing more safe. Like Jesus, King proclaimed that another way must be trod. He upholds a simple moral law. Hate cannot conquer hate, only love can do that. Repeat that with me. Hate cannot conquer hate. Only love can do that. Hate and violence simply multiply themselves. His message: you have to love the segregator, the Klansman, the oppressor. Agape, tough medicine. Indeed, to To some in his audience, King was asking them to love the very people who took picture postcards, perhaps, of their loved one's body after a lynching. A sick but true habit in the American South of the time. How would you respond to someone telling you to do this? The first step King taught was forgiveness. Only the injured party can bestow forgiveness. Withholding forgiveness poisons the withholder, he teaches. This does not mean that we rush back into relationship with one who has harmed us. We decide when and if we ever let an evildoer back into our lives or near our presence. But we must forgive, because to not forgive will poison us. And we must try to hold them in agape love, even if from afar. King continues, the evil deed is separate from the person. The evil deed is never all a person truly is. In other words, hate the sin, love the sinner. Again, I'm sure that guy in the coffee shop would tell me it's not that easy. And you know what? It's not. Lofty spiritual goals are difficult. Hate the sin and love the sinner. Today, he might advise some of us, okay, hate Trumpism, but love the Trumper. He has met enemies like mine and yours. In fact, I would say probably more fierce, at least than my enemies. Don't you see? We do not build a better world by hating and mimicking the evil acts of confused persons acting out of ignorance. The evil act never expresses all of a person's being. This is key for King, because in his philosophy, which echoes that of Jesus, every person, even those who commit the most heinous acts, have some connection to the divine love that brought all of us into being. There lies an embryonic conscience in the evildoer, he writes. And that conscience needs agape love to awaken it. This does not mean we do not protect ourselves and our neighbors from abuse and brutality while we wait for the fruits of our love campaign to blossom. Indeed, King believes the hope for victory for marginalized peoples often lies in the hope and possibility that an awakening of moral conscience will move the oppressor to understand how much they demean themselves and the holy when they oppress others. Thereby, King sought to save the soul of white America by hoping to awaken its conscience. There is simply some good in the worst of us and some evil in the best of us, King cries. Radical. And King also makes it clear, of course, and thank goodness, that Jesus doesn't ask us to like our enemies. That's impossible. But the difficult quest is agape love. Can we have redemptive, creative goodwill even for our enemies? And to tell us why we should, King teaches us loving your enemies is the only way, because, as he says, hate scars the soul and it distorts the personality. Hate destroys the hater, and it causes the hater to describe the ugly as beautiful and the true as false. We see that in our world, don't we? It's only love that promotes emotional and spiritual well-being. And furthermore, King warns, the chain reaction of evil, hate begetting hate, wars producing more wars, must be broken, or we shall be plunged into the dark abyss of annihilation. You see, other realities made people think more soberly about the future of humankind back then. Existential urgency was high in the 1950s. The fear of nuclear annihilation invited people often to think existentially, coexist or go extinct. This first generation after the atomic bomb could not escape knowing that nuclear annihilation was possible. The specter of life on planet Earth evaporating in a mushroom cloud played a huge part of the culture's conceptual background. How many of you remember those days of duck and cover, of fallout shelters? And though the danger of nuclear war still exists today, it is not in our conscience the way it was back then. Indeed, I grew up towards the tail end of this era, very aware of nuclear terror. I was aware of being heir to a Cold War I did not create and did not want. Most of my early music and poetry was written about the fear of Armageddon, for goodness sake. And maybe that is why there's so many end times Christians today. They grew up in that era too. But in the face of that horrifying nuclear reality, King was even more convinced that only one thing could work, and that was the eradication of enemies altogether. The ultimate triumph of agape love. He teaches love is the only force which can turn an enemy into a friend. Many enemies much scarier and more heavily armed than mine. And today, King's legacy continues to inspire and to be debated and sometimes abused. But here, I'll share some images so we can better remember him. First, from the basement of that Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, I call this the Angelic King. It's a mural all over the basement walls in Dexter. Next is this photo I love of him with his family in 1957. But I like to remember King as a tireless organizer. All those sermons and movements and campaigns, they came from hard work. They came from organizing. They came from reading. They came from meetings. They came from finding common ground and laying aside differences for the goodness of all. It's a real example of ego being surmounted for the accomplishment of the holy mission of black liberation. And when people organize and when they gather, nothing gets them ready for the work like singing. Indeed, during the Civil Rights era, when you went to an organizing meeting, if you didn't sing, they would not invite you back. True story. So sing we shall. Indeed, on every Martin Luther King Sunday, we sing the song known as the Black National Anthem. Lift every voice and sing.
This is written by James Weldon Johnson in 1900. Please rise in body and spirit and let us sing with gusto.
Voice
love which asks for nothing in return, loves all people on a deep level simply because we are products of the same divine love.
Love my enemies? Have you met them? Well, considering that we've tried everything else without being able to bring about the beloved communities, perhaps we need to try loving our enemies.